Early in her career, she adopted a showy habit, strictly forbidden, of buzzing the airfield whenever she achieved a kill. Coming back to base after a successful mission, she'd break formation, perform high-speed victory rolls and low-altitude passes. And Passportnikova said, after this circus number in the air, Lilia would always ask me, "Did Batya swear terribly?" And if I said terribly, she would hang her head before walking over to him with her post-mission report. So she was careful to try and look contrite even after she had knowingly broken the rules. She was wounded on March 22nd, 1943, flying as a group of 6 fighters that were attacking a dozen German bombers. She shot down one bomber when she felt a sharp pain in her leg. She found herself in a single-handed dogfight against 6 Me-109 fighters. And in a kind of aerial game of chicken, she pushed the throttle forward, raced directly into the enemy formation. At the last minute, they veered off, and she shot down one of the fighters before the fight ended. She managed to land successfully in severe pain, losing a lot of blood from her leg, and she was afterwards sent back to Moscow for surgery and recovery. She got permission to recuperate at home when the surgery was over because hospital beds were in pretty short supply, but she was restless and anxious, wanted to get back to the front, and within just a few days she talked her way onto a transport and got back to her regiment. She never saw her family again. But less than 6 weeks after being wounded, Litviak was back on the scoreboard. She made 3 kills in May and 4 more in July of 1943. But the month of May brought tragedy for Litviak as well as victory. On the 6th of May, Nikolai Baranov died when he attempted to bail out of his burning aircraft. His chute opened, but the pilots watched him plummet to his death with the burning parachute trailing behind him, unable to do anything. And in the same month, Litviak suffered an even deeper loss. Before the eyes of the whole regiment, Alexei Salomatin was conducting a training flight with a new pilot that had come into the unit and for unexplained reasons crashed and was killed. Only 2 weeks earlier, he had been awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union medal. You can see Litviak here. If you look just to the right of the coffin, the very short person. You can also see Budanova next to her. There's a lot that's been written about a supposed romance going on between Salomatin and Litviak. Passportnikova says that everyone knew Salomatin was in love with her, but according to Litviak's letters, she didn't realize that she loved him until after his death. There's a lot of nonsense written about this great romance they had flying together. In fact, she had herself transferred away because she felt he was too distracting. But I have a copy of a letter that she wrote to her mother a few days after the funeral. And what she wrote there was, "Fate has snatched away my best friend, Yosha Salomatin. He was everyone's favorite, and he loved me very much. But at that time, he was not my ideal. And now it's terrible for me to endure, and I confide, Mamachka, that I valued this friendship only in the moment of his death. If he had remained alive, then surely this friendship would have become exceptionally beautiful and strong. You see, he was a fellow not to my taste, but his persistence and love for me compelled me to love him. And now it seems to me I will never again meet such a person." So by this point, Baranov and Salomatin both had died. It seems that Litviak became increasingly daring, some people might say reckless after that point. She was wounded again in July of 1943, but refused to even be sent to the hospital, said that the wounds simply weren't serious. But in July, she also lost her friend Katya Budanova. Budanova had shot down 2 Me-109s, but was mortally wounded in the process. She managed to land her plane, but she was already dying when the local villagers pulled her out of her aircraft. And Litviak was then stunned once more and had lost all her dearest friends from the regiment. The very next day, Litviak barely survived a fierce air battle and had to bail out of her burning aircraft. She made it back to her regiment, but her final flight took place 10 days later on August 1st, 1943, on the outskirts of the Battle of Kursk. On her fourth flight of the day, she participated in a mass air battle involving 6 Yak-1s against 12 German fighters and 30 bombers. She shot down 2 Me-109s that day and then was seen flying into the clouds, trailing smoke as she attempted to evade 2 more German fighters that were attacking her. They never found her aircraft, and so her first worst fear was realized. Her records were marked missing without a trace. All the commendations that she was recommended for were never given because they couldn't find her body. Now, Passportnikova vowed that she would not rest until they did find the body. And some of you know, some Russians know, that it was very common in the Soviet Union for many decades after the war for people to go out in the summers, especially certain children's groups like Young Pioneers, and look for remains of people who had been killed in the war and try to identify the bodies. It took 40 years before they finally found Litvyak's body. And in May of 1990, Mikhail Gorbachev posthumously awarded her the Medal of the Hero of the Soviet Union. The Soviet press didn't treat these women as great PR heroes. They did not get a great deal of publicity. In fact, they like to stress that even during the rigors of the front, women could remain women. And in fact, by 1945, they were stressing new roles for women. Pravda, in March of 1945, noted that women in the Red Army have proved themselves as pilots and soldiers, but they don't forget that their primary duty to the Soviet state is that of motherhood. In July of 1945, the president, Kalinin, spoke to a group of demobilized women soldiers. And this is his final advice to them. Imagine this being said to male veterans. He said, "Allow me, as one grown wise with years, to say to you, do not give yourself airs in your future practical work. Do not talk about the services you rendered. Let others do it for you. That will be better." Well, I'd like to think that despite the efforts of people like Kalinin, these people will not be forgotten, and that more people will read about them and learn that women have been in combat. So I just want to mention one other thing. All the work I've told you about was part of my master's work. What I did for my PhD dissertation was then to go on and compare, compare what had happened in the United States with what happened in Russia. Very interesting, there's a lot of similarities in the two groups, about 1,000 women in each case. Recruitment and training was very similar, but of course the missions were quite different. So the book I'm working on, finally trying to turn my dissertation into a book this summer, is called Limited Skies, and it has that direct comparison of the United States and the Soviet Union. And that's it. Any questions?
Your last statement led right into the entire disconnect I was feeling the whole time I was listening to you. I'm sitting here thinking, we never saw this in World War II with women, but yet everything I've ever heard, and I don't know that much, nowhere near what you know, about Soviet society says that women really weren't treated that well or aren't viewed that well. How in the world did this happen from a societal standpoint, and also how did the men interact with these women, not just the individual, but I'm forward here. This is a total disconnect. Can you figure out what I'm trying to ask you?
Sure, yeah, those are great questions. There are some dichotomies in Soviet society. Women had equal rights from 1917 on in ways that they didn't in any other major country as far as legal rights go. So in that regard, they actually were treated better. In cultural roles, it's true that the men still refused to do any cooking or childcare, so when women went to work, and before the war, 40% of all factory workers were women, so they had their Rosie the Riveter already, but Rosie was coming home and doing all the domestic chores as well. So the culture didn't change along with the way things changed in the workplace. I've got a whole section on things like unit cohesion and what happened with men. What's really interesting is a phenomenon that we've seen often in sociology, is that the groups that were most opposed or had the most bad things to say about women, either soldiers or pilots or anything else, tended to be men that either never worked with any of those women or had a very small number of them in the unit. The men that flew often with the women or that were in these regiments almost always wrote very good things about them and treated them as colleagues and comrades. So a lot of it had to do with exposure. Of course, you know, there are always individuals in any unit that can go one way or the other. There were some units, some women who felt that segregation was better. They just didn't want to have to deal with the men because there was always a learning curve in the beginning when it was new for women and men to fly together. But other women that were in the integrated regiments felt that that was better, that it was normal the way that life should be.
How do you segregate your thinking to say culturally you must be home tending the fire with the babies, but paid work, paid employment, you're equal? How do you do that disconnect and not make any strides?
Well, that's a really good question, but the Soviets aren't alone in having that cultural mentality. You know, I dare say some of you have had husbands and friends that didn't necessarily pull their full weight domestically, even if you're working full time. So that's a good question, but it's a question more for sociologists maybe than a historian.